Well, here we are. Do you want to say something, Rob, or shall I start? Go for it. There is a funeral coming at 11:30, so I don't want to mention it. Somebody said, well, it's probably yours, Barb, and you'll be speaking at it. And he just walked in and sat down. Hi, Ruth. Well, it is being Zoomed, so I have to behave myself. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. The day after, as Sue reminded me, the day after Thanksgiving, or the weekend after, is not always the easiest time. But I thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be upright and with people I love and care about. I'm lucky. And what did you just say? So, you see, with friends like this, who needs enemies? Advent, in many ways, is a favorite season of mine, and I don't know what you think about this season that begins tomorrow. Any thoughts about Advent? Is it special in any way to any of you? Why do you love it, Sue? You're a little more introspective, she said, and yes, I'm going to just do it. Yeah. Okay. She said she loves Advent because it puts you in it's the beginning of a wonderful event, and it also makes you a little more introspective. Anybody else, why Advent is favorable for you, loving it? Sue? Should be. Sue was saying the Black Friday and all the shopping, and she's going to something about Advent where our focus should be. So, well, I welcome you, and I welcome those who are watching, Zooming, and I'm grateful for them, and I hope this is helpful for you. I'm going to postpone our prayer for just a few moments while I give a little introduction. When I told Rob what I was going to do, and he's always nice and says fine, but I decided to share 4 lectures that deal with Advent and how Advent has so much to teach us, and you hinted at that a bit, Sue. While I was getting ready for this extravaganza, I received a preaching journal that I like, and an author had a view that really helped me. His name is Walter Brueggemann, and he's an Old Testament scholar. I think he's Presbyterian, and he looks just like Jeremiah. Looks just like him. And he shared a view that helped me as I proceeded with my lectures. He spoke about the word subversive. And I always thought of subversive as some action that trying to make a change, trying to overturn something, and very often doing it undercover. But Brueggemann offered a different view. He writes that understanding words enables us to see another meaning. So he took the word subversive and he said sub means under. And versive can mean version. And so he writes, the Advent Christmas memories of the church do indeed subvert. In other words, they subvert a dominant vision of the world. In other words, to who is superior in the world and who carries legitimacy in the world. So his thoughts are intertwined with mine. And here is my outline, and I know we have a funeral at 11:30 and we'll be out right at 11. Each of the lectures can stand alone. They're connected, but they can stand alone. So if one doesn't work for you, it's going to be fine. The theme I selected, who are the personalities and what are the stories of the season we need to experience, and what difference have they made? In other words, how subversive are they? Do they offer us a different version of the stories around this season? So today we're going to focus on Luke. Next week we're going to look at 3 characters that are prominent but don't certainly get the prominence we perhaps should give them: Zechariah, Elizabeth, and Joseph. And the third week, some interesting literature that's been written about Mary. We'll focus on her. And the last week, I want to talk about the power of the Incarnation. What does that really mean for us, that the Divine One took on our human nature? How have these folks or events subverted our general understanding and the way we view Advent? Now, the one other thing I'd like to ask, when you heard about Advent lectures, is there any question you had in your mind that you said, gee, I wish she'd talk about it? Ooh, that makes it nice. Okay, good. So let's begin with a prayer from Luke. This is the opening of Luke's gospel. Now, you know this liturgical church year, Luke is our companion for the year. And here's how he opens the Acts of his gospel. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, long sentence, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So in that very first paragraph, he says, I'm going to write an orderly account, and I'm going to pass on these stories to you, Theophilus, so that you have begun to be instructed, but I want you to get the story from me. So then in the Acts of the Apostles, here's how he starts this book. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about the things that Jesus did and taught from the beginning until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. What do you see in those 2 introductions? See anything in there? Rich? Person. Yeah. In the Acts? Excellent. A+. In the star on the forehead. In the Luke Gospel, he's writing to obviously a Greek who's learning about the faith, and he's going to do it in an orderly way. And then when he gets to the Acts of the Apostles, he mentions the same man again. So what a lot of us don't know is Luke wrote 2 volumes. The first about Jesus and the gospel, the second about the expanding of the church and the work of both Peter and Paul. So our companion during this year has 2 volumes on his biography, his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. There is one tradition that floats around about Luke, the gospel writer, but we don't really have any proof of it, that he was a physician. You've probably heard that, okay? Some church fathers believe that he was a companion of Paul's, but we really don't have anything to prove that either, except once in a while in the Acts of the Apostles, he slips into the first person as though he was accompanying Paul. But we really, by the time he wrote the gospel, his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, Paul had been dead for a while. We think his letter was written between the 70s and the 80s in AD, or CE, the Common Era. That's 40 to 50 years after Jesus. So when I was putting this little thing together, I said to myself, where were you when Pearl Harbor happened on December the 7th in 1941? I remember my aunt running upstairs to get her rosaries, and I remember hearing Roosevelt's voice, and I was 8, maybe 8. Now think of what has happened since 1941, December the 7th, to December the 7th, 2021, 80 years. So you have to keep that in mind when we think about our own history. Then think about what happened in the community for whom Luke was writing this. 40 to 50 years after Jesus. What happens in a community during those years, like what has happened to us since Pearl Harbor? What kind of things happen? Pardon me? Good and bad happen. We learn more about a situation, when papers are revealed. Our culture changes dramatically. Who would have thought in December 7th, 1941, that people of Japanese descent would be now appointed to high political office or elected to a political office? Pardon me, dear? Yeah, the governor of Massachusetts is Asian. Who would have thought that 80 years ago? Now, when you think about the time between the writing of Luke's gospel and when the events happened, what kind of things were happening in that little community? What was happening that probably influenced Luke? There's the primary. Did I send you my notes? You have the answers today, Richard. What can I say? One of the big, lucky twice, one of the big things that happened in 70 was that the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. That would be like saying St. Peter's was bombed. It changed the world for the Jews. That's one thing that happened after Jesus passed. The other thing that happened was the church, which they then called the Way, not Christian yet, the Way was catching on with non-Jews. Now think about December 1941, what it must have been like to be an Italian. I can say this because I am half, an Italian living in Rochester, New York in 1941. If you had a vowel at the end of your name, you weren't going anywhere in leadership. Well, think about what was happening in the Jewish community after Jesus died and left. There were changes happening. People were beginning to be attracted to the message, and they weren't Jews. They were Greeks or non-Jews, Gentiles. And therefore, the needs of Luke's community were changing. They were very different from 30 when Jesus died. And remember, Jesus was not born with a blueprint for St. Peter's. Jesus wanted to bring a message of reform to the Jewish community. He died, he rose, he left, and now his message was very popular among poor Gentiles, Greeks, and it was moving. And that created some conflict within the community. The Gentiles' presence made a huge difference in Luke's community, just as immigrants made a huge difference in our community. Most of us, my grandparents, were not born here. And so Luke, and then of course there were intermarriages. You remember what an intermarriage was when we were coming up, Catholic and Lutheran? Or Italian and Irish, stand back. You all know those stories. So by the time Luke is ready to write his gospel, intermarriages were taking place, the message of Jesus was spreading, and there were persecutions that were going on. One other big difference is that Luke was writing in a language that Jesus did not speak. He was writing in Greek. And so, how does that make a difference? The translations were difficult. Now, I'm not a great linguist, and so I have at home what I call a huge Greek Hebrew dictionary. So when a word comes up, I can go there and say, what did that mean then? I had a professor once, Father Falcone, said, what are people going to say about us when they look up our artifacts? And they find a paper that said, Barbara was such a Georgia peach. Or a hot tomato. They're going to say, what was wrong with them? Until you understood the culture and how we explain things. Luke's works he really has 2 volumes. Now, he obviously admired Paul, because in the Acts of the Apostles, he slips into the personal pronoun, writing about Paul, and you almost think that he was with him. But he has great respect for Paul. His readers were mostly Greek-speaking, and they were obviously Christian. But he was trying, like any good pastor, to pull out of his handbag, so to speak, those things that were going to make the Christian message resonate with a non-Jewish audience. That's what all the gospel writers did. They had a table here loaded with stories and miracles and so forth. They picked the ones that would meet the need of their communities. He focused his gospel on the Gentiles, the newest members, and they had questions. What were these Jewish roots? And the Jews had questions about them. They were willing to make the Gentiles second-class Christians. You got to be circumcised and keep the diet and so forth. And finally, the apostles said, no, you come into the church. We wouldn't be here if they had not made those decisions. Luke's gospel has some parables that aren't in the other gospels. And before we leave today, we're going to look at one of them. He has the parable of the prodigal son. He has the parable of Lazarus. He has the parable of the lost coin and the Good Samaritan. Luke places Jesus, and I think this is so interesting. He does this more than any other. He places Jesus within the context of the world in which he was born. For example, he speaks about King Herod when John was born. He speaks about a census under Augustus Caesar. He names the governor of Syria. When John begins his ministry, he speaks about Tiberius Caesar. So that Luke had the wisdom to place Jesus' message in the context of the world in which it was proclaimed. Why is that important? Why do you think it's important to have that political piece? That might be what they listen to. It might also tell the readers and listeners what they were putting up with. And it might also tell the readers why they were being persecuted. Because the political environment, we do it all the time. We try to take our Christian message and put it into the political environment in which we are living. Feed the hungry, get your vaccination, visit the sick. We do the very same thing. And it's helpful because we understand the environment in which Jesus found himself. He also mentions in his gospel the religious leaders. And I think that's important. We mention Pope Francis all the time, because these people in power impact the way we live our daily lives. Well, where did Luke get his material? He plagiarized Mark. Both Matthew and Luke plagiarized Mark. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. They drew on Mark. They drew on oral sources. Luke drew on stories that were going around. He also had some written sources that they called Q, that he put into his gospel. And then we have some things that aren't in any other gospel that we call L. They just belong to Luke. So he drew from multiple sources. He doesn't always keep accurate history, although his tale of Paul's journeys are quite accurate. And what Luke is trying to do is show us how God fulfilled the promises made to the prophets. In other words, for Luke, the story of Jesus is rooted in Israel. He talks right from the beginning how he was presented in the temple. And Luke has a considerable focus on women, perhaps more than any other gospel. It's interesting, he focuses on Mary. Matthew focuses on Joseph. It's fascinating. There is an author by the name of Barbara Reed. I got it. And she's written a 3-volume work, Parables for Preachers. And she's a Dominican sister, and teaches at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And this is what she writes in an article about the themes that appear in Luke that you'll be hearing during the year. Luke is very clear about the inclusiveness of God. Very clear. So that theme of inclusivity is there. The theme of compassion on the part of Jesus Christ is there. He uses at length parables to teach about God. There is a tone of happiness and delight in his gospel. Like the woman finds the coin and sweeps and then finds it and calls in everybody for a party. The lost sheep is found and everybody celebrates. He has a focus on the Holy Spirit, which we will see in the Acts of the Apostles. He sets the whole gospel in a theme of journey, that eventually Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem. He sets his face to Jerusalem. Reed tells us that Luke emphasizes hospitality. Luke emphasizes the inclusion of outsiders, like the Gentiles. And there is a prominent place for women in his text. So, how might we say, after we hear these things, that Luke was subversive, trying to teach us something different? The inclusivity, the prominence of women, the acceptance of outsiders. I watched a little something this morning about a teacher who was trying to instruct her students about slavery. And you know, that's a huge debatable subject in public schools. And she had one little fella in class, he had to be about 10 or 12, and he kept arguing with her saying, the Asians have more difficulty than the blacks. And yet they do better. And she said, well, in some cases that's true, but you don't have all your facts. In other words, they weren't brought here in 1619 as slaves. And it was so hard, she couldn't get that little fella to see the difference. And think about what Luke faced when he was trying to say, particularly to the Jewish community, the Gentiles are our brothers and sisters, and we're going to accept them. Inclusivity. So I think he also is a little subversive in the way he elevates women to positions of leadership within the church. And look how long it has taken for us, and we're still not there. What would B say? Yeah. So what are these thoughts saying to you about the gospel you're going to be hearing every Sunday and sometimes during the week? You'll be getting a different perspective, and you have to say, oh, I got to remember to whom he was speaking. I think there's a statement, you get a star, that Luke is looking into the future as much as he was looking into the past. And that's a great lesson for all of us, isn't it? Exactly. There has to be a recognition of the past in order to go forward. And that's why in the gospel, he tells the journey from Bethlehem straight through to Calvary. And he puts it in a journey. You need to know the past. You need to know the message. But you have to have an eye to the future. Anybody else? All right, that's a great point. Sue said the difficulty is, as we're reading these passages now in 2021, 70 years, yeah, or when we look at things in the present context, it is difficult to understand what was really happening at the time when things happened. And that's why a historical understanding of the scriptures is helpful. What was going on at that particular time? And that's why Luke uses the... Right. That's right. Luke is providing context for his community. Now take that idea, Sue, that Luke was trying to help the community to whom and for whom he was writing. Think about what John was doing. We're getting up almost into the year 90. Now we're 60 years out from the resurrection. And John is writing to a community that already believes and is being spread. So each of the gospel writers, the critical thing for them, what does my community need? And that's what a pastor does. What does my community here at St. Catherine's need? And Transfiguration. And even as much as they're alike, they're different. To be aware of the needs. So when we hear that, I think to myself, what if the Council of Jerusalem did not went along with some of the Jewish leadership and made the Gentiles, males, be circumcised, made them follow a particular diet? We would have had a two-tiered Christianity. That's right. Right. Peter was strong. Peter backslid a bit, though. He went to Cornelius' house and stayed with him and baptized the whole group, and then he got criticized and he backed away. But the Council of Jerusalem, which Luke speaks about in the Acts of the Apostles, saved the day. It kept the church united around Jesus. And that's another way in which Luke's gospel is subversive. To think that his gospel would focus on outsiders, with Rome was the big insider. That's right, and that's because Peter and Paul didn't agree, because Peter started down the path of acceptance, went to Cornelius' home, had dinner with them, baptized the whole family, and then he pulled back. He backslid, so to speak. And then he and Paul said, I withstood him to his face. The two of them were disagreeing, and the Council of Jerusalem solved it. Or we wouldn't be here. So those are the things I wanted to say to you about Luke's gospel before we turn to one parable. Do you have anything you want to say in addition or ask, or is it clear? Pretty much. The subversion thing is a little difficult. Yes, it is a difference, yes. And that's not saying it's absolutely right. But in a sense, what is, Luke, it seems to me, is a bit subversive when he elevates the role of women. Because remember, Mary was there when the Holy Spirit came, and other women. Yes, all right, I accept that. Subversive is a negative word. Brueggemann is trying to give it a positive slant. Okay, in other words, think of it this way. Brueggemann is saying, Luke is saying things that are going to undo the way we think. So, in the Gospel of Mary, which isn't in the canon, Mary Magdalene is telling the apostles things that Jesus told her, and Peter rises up and says, now listen, who are you to do that? So for the church to turn the table and recognize the place of women is what Brueggemann is trying to say. It's subversive. They're going against the mainstream. Okay. Well, I think, don't hold your breath. And when they lay me out, say she tried. Put that on her tombstone. She tried. What? Yes, sir. Well, go ahead. That's yeah. Well, I can answer that in two ways. Now, first of all, you're absolutely correct, because we read it from our vantage point, and we see the ways in which the church was not inclusive then. In any culture, women were not. So we're looking back with our own 21st century eyes. But to some extent, it had to be catching on because the church spread to non-Jews. And eventually, some Jews obviously became Christians, but the message shifted and moved to areas that were not Jewish. So in that sense, it caught on because it accepted the poor, the peasant, and so forth. But we can never underestimate the power of culture, which remained pretty steady. Yeah. That's why it's so important to understand we look at these things through our own eyes. But what was happening then, we have to understand as well. But then, I also think we say God's word is sort of everlasting, living. So we bring our understanding to it. We have to. How else can it make sense for us? Good question. Well, look at the changes that have happened in our lifetime at Vatican II. That's right. That's right. And the more changes will come. The more changes will come. I have a young friend. Her mother was my dearest friend. And I was at all her children's weddings. I walked through her divorce with her. I met her new husband. And her second oldest child has two boys. One has come out as gay, and one as transgender. Now think of the change in that family, trying to maintain community and love. It's an issue most of us never pretty much dealt with. I had a gay cousin, everybody knew it, but nobody said it. And what agony people went through. But culture changes. And think of what's to come. Pretty soon I won't have to drive the car. I can just sit down and tell it where to go. I'm afraid of that one, though. I'm afraid of that one. All right. I'd like to now, before we get into trouble with the funeral, I'd like to close this with a look at one parable that Luke has. It's a string of three. He talks about the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son, the prodigal son. And I'm going to read the parable, and I'm going to ask you if you heard anything different, or if anything struck you, and do you have any different conclusions about it? So this is Luke 15. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them, Jesus addressed this parable. A father had two sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend to the swine. And he longed to eat the pods on which the swine fed, but no one gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, how many of my father's hired workers have enough food to eat, but here I am dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired workers. So he got up, went back to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. The son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. But his father ordered his servants, quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fatted calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back he neared the house. He heard the sound of music and dancing and called one of his servants and asked what it might mean. The servant said to him, Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fatted calf, because he has him back safe and sound. The son became angry and refused to enter the house, and the father came out and pleaded with him. And he said to his father, Look, all these years I served you and did not once disobey your orders, and you never gave me a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fatted calf. And the father said to him, My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. Pardon me? It's a tussle. It's a tussle. The first thing, I know, gentlemen, back there, I'm going to be out in plenty of time. Okay, it's a tussle because at the very beginning of the gospel, Luke wants us to know when that boy went to his father and said, split the inheritance between us, it was the worst insult in that culture that any child could give to the father. In a way, it's saying, I wish you were dead, but you're not, but I want the money now. So that makes the story even harder because of what that son asked. What else do you hear there? I hear the attitude of the other son. This isn't fair. Look what I have done for you. And you never did anything like this for me. There's the tussle which parents probably have experienced. Sue said 2 points. As a mother, and a parent, she could understand. But as an older or younger brother or sister, she might feel the same way. Henry Nouwen has written a wonderful book on the Prodigal Son, and he draws, he goes through the parable beautifully, but the picture by Rembrandt shows the father putting his hands on the shoulder of the boy who's kneeling at his feet. And when you look at it carefully, one hand is feminine and one hand is masculine. It's almost like Rembrandt is saying the parents, but other scholars say, well, where was the mother in all of this? And why didn't the older boy step forward and try to talk some reason into his brother? Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't want to. There's so many ways to look at this. And for some scripture scholars, they ask the question, who really is the prodigal son? For some, the older one is at this point, well, he absolutely refuses to go in. Who's the sinner? See, so you see, you can look at this. It's almost a subversive parable in a way. You can, in a way, I know I love the word. I'm working on it, and don't say what else have you got either. But think about this. Number one, the insult to the father. The awful insult. And then he ran to meet the boy and embraced him and did all he could. I think what Jesus was doing there was trying to say us what God is really like. The compassion of God. Despite us. No matter what we do, we can come back. And I've been in the place where I've been angry at something and just stayed away. And it took me a while, not in my family, but in church things. We all have faced situations like this, but this is very dramatically told. The basic theme that Luke is trying to say is, when we make a mistake and we come back, we're either sought after or come back, but we're welcomed and forgiven. It's sometimes hearing it is different than reading it. You hear things you didn't hear before. Oh, listen, I was going to do it in Greek, but I decided not. You'd have left by, it'd have been Greek to me too. So anything else that a parent might want to say about this gospel? Think about what Luke is trying to say to his community. God is compassionate. But he's also saying, don't be the elder son here. In other words, I read one account that said, did the elder son make any effort to stop his brother? Or maybe he didn't want to, as you said. But there certainly were different. All through the scriptures, you find brothers at odds. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau. Yeah. Okay. It was, and that's right, and that's why it's helpful to know the culture, because even now that would be true. I want the money right now. You're not dying on me. I want the money right now. But in that culture, you might change your mind. That's right. And I've read one place that usually the money was divided equally. He said he divided the money. Did he give more to the younger or less? We don't know those things. Jesus lets us mull those around. But money, as my middle niece says, brings out the goo in family business. Weddings, funerals, and wills. Okay, so there we are with the companion we have. How much time is it? 11 minutes and 20 seconds. Here we are with our new companion for this year, Luke. And when you begin to hear him, it's going to be a little difficult this Sunday because for some reason the church chooses the end times for the gospel instead of the birth. I don't quite get it, but that's okay. It's okay. That's a lot I don't get. Any other question? Well, I thank you for coming. God bless you all, and we'll hopefully see you next week. And Rob, good luck with the funeral. Okay. Pardon me? Don't be late. He's right back there. Don't be late. Okay, take care. Safe home now. Oh, honey. I mean it.
Feel better.
You feel better?
I do.
I'm going to be subversive with you.
No, Dad.
Oh. That's true. And the servants that had to get everything ready. Oh, yeah, the fatted calf is good.
Grew up on John Street, you know where RIT is?
Yes.
It was named after his father, John Drew. And the deal was when he reached 21, he could stay on the farm and inherit part of it, or get $1,000 and go into town. $1,000 and went into town. Never went back to the farm. And he married my grandmother.
Well, that's good, because we
Yeah.
wouldn't have had you.
But I'm involved in a lawsuit right now